Good morning. Morning came a little bit earlier today than usual, didn't it? It's good to see you all here this morning. We have entered into the season of Lent, and over the next 40 days, interspersed by Sundays, we'll be looking at some spiritual practices that we can engage in throughout Lent that will help us spiritually renew ourselves. And the sermon series that we're entering into is called Still Waters. If you've ever heard Psalm 23, you've heard that line in Psalm 23 that says that God is our shepherd, that God will lead us beside the still waters. And this idea is that sheep are more calm when they're beside still waters rather than rushing waters. And I thought about that imagery, and I thought about how we in our lives are always in a rush, always in a hurry. And what does it look like for us to be still within us? How do we still ourselves within and be content and fulfilled and experience God's peace within us, even though the world may be rushing around us? Even though the world may not be still, how do we be still before God, just as we heard sung this morning? So we're going to be looking at some things that will help us in our spiritual walks, in our faith, and in our relationship to God that will help us to be still and to have those still waters within. The other thing I'm going to suggest this morning to you, that if you have a pen or something to write with, I'm going to suggest this morning that you take notes. I know that we often don't do that, but I'm going to be sharing a lot of concepts, and it'll be more of a teaching this morning than a preaching. And so you may want to take some notes along the way to help out as I go along. And then the third thing I want to say as a disclaimer, can I give a disclaimer this morning? There are times in a preacher's life when I have to preach a sermon that I don't imitate. Does that make sense? That I am called at times to preach the Word of God, and so the Word of God is always calling us to a higher standard, and I don't always meet that standard. That's what I'm saying. So this is one of those sermons like your parents used to say, do as I say, not as I do. Does that make sense? Okay. So you with me here this morning? So again, I'm pointing us to the Scripture and what the Scripture is teaching, not what Matt would teach you to do. All right? So with that in mind, let's talk about a word that has become popular today, the word multitasking. How many people use that word a lot now? You know, multitasking. Now, let's take a look at, what does multitasking look like? Does it look like this? You know? Multitasking, because we needed another word for unable to focus on the task at hand, right? We can't focus. We keep flitting here and there. We keep going to this thing or that thing. You know, I find myself, I've got a crackberry. I left in the office this morning. But, it's like, well, you can't talk on the phone and drive now, right? So what do we do? I don't know if this is what you do, but what I do is when I get to the stoplight, I've got like a whole minute of wasted time. I don't want to waste the time, so I grab it, check my email, check in if I got a text, or, put the Bluetooth in, get ready to make a phone. Does anybody else do that now at the stoplight? Or you just have that extra minute to check on whatever it is on that PDA that we've got. You think about our PDAs today, it used to be you just had a cell phone, right? What do you do with a phone? You talk on it, right? You talk to somebody else. You have a conversation. Now we text on it. We check email on it. We update our Facebook status on it. We take pictures with it. We take video with it. We download a game to play when we have some downtime if we're sitting in a dock. See what I'm saying? And so we can't ever be still. I found myself the other morning walking my daughter to the bus stop, and as I went out the door, I grabbed the BlackBerry, and I started checking email as I walked out the front door, and we have to walk a ways to get to the bus stop, and so I'm checking my email the whole way, and then we're standing at the bus stop, I'm still checking my email, and finally I looked up, and my daughter goes, you've been checking your email the whole time we've been out here. Kids do that stuff too, don't they? And I was like, you're right. So I put the BlackBerry away. And so here's what I'm giving up for Lent. We talk about giving stuff up for Lent. And we don't give up, I want to be clear, we talk about this, but we don't give up stuff just to go on a diet, okay? We give up the things that keep us distracted from God or from other people or being in relationship with God or others. So what I decided to do was to I took email and Facebook off of my PDA, off of my BlackBerry. because what I found was what it was doing in my life was it was just a filler. You know what I'm talking about? Anytime I had a little bit, a few minutes, it became a filler for those few minutes. And so I wasn't engaging in relationship with God or anybody else. I was just filling my time with the BlackBerry. And so I decided for Lent, I'm giving it up. So if you don't get an email response from me right away anymore, I'm usually fairly trying to respond right away, but if I don't, you'll know why. And so call me or text. I still get texts, so you can text me. But we live an overscheduled, we wonder why we're stressed out all the time. It's because we've overscheduled ourselves. We've overextended ourselves sometimes, and we're limited, finite human beings. Meyer Friedman, who's a cardiologist and studied type A behavior, has termed this phrase something called hurry sickness. That some of us type A personalities have a thing called hurry sickness. And here's how he defines hurry sickness. Above all, a continuous struggle and unremitting attempt to accomplish or achieve more and more things or participate in more and more events in less and less time, frequently in the face of opposition, real or imagined, from other persons. Do you ever feel that way? You're trying to get more and more into life in less and less time? Do you ever feel that way? Like you're trying to get more, grab more, have more, do more? And we've become these human doings rather than human beings. And you think about, so we do all that, and it's none of that's really bad or wrong or sinful, but there is a cost, isn't there? There's a cost to our hurriedness. There's a cost to our busyness. And I think about what the cost is. Well, let me give you an example, and before I do, let me give you a statistic. What is the number one drug of choice in America today? Every survey, you guys get it every time. Caffeine. 90% of Americans consume caffeine on a regular basis. 90% of us. We are the world's largest consumer of coffee. The number one nation consumer. We consume coffee more than any other nation, meaning we buy more coffee. Americans drink 400 million cups of coffee a day. That's more than the population of the United States daily. So that's our drug of choice, right? Isn't it? I mean, why do we drink coffee? Or think about energy drinks. Energy drinks were introduced to Americans in 1997. They came out with Red Bull. You remember Red Bull commercials and Red Bull, right? The energy tastes horrible. And we started drinking it. The sales of energy drinks has doubled each year since 1997 up until this year. Think about that. It is a multi-billion-dollar business, energy drinks now. Something that didn't even exist, just 15 years ago. So what's happening in our culture today that we feel that we need the stimulant, that we need the extra boost of energy, the 5-hour energy shot you can go get at the gas station. Why is it that we feel that we need that? Well, let me give you another study they did. They did this with mice because they keep saying they're like humans. I don't know why it's like the safe way to study humans without studying humans, I guess. And so they did a study, and they gave a mouse a dose of amphetamines. Now, amphetamines is another stimulant. It's called speed, and it hypes you up, and it helps you be real focused and have a lot of energy. And so they gave a mouse a dose of speed, and they found out that it took a very high dosage of amphetamine to actually kill the mouse. But what they did was they said, if we take that same mouse and put it in a group of other mice on amphetamines, it only takes the dosage, 1/20th the dosage of amphetamine for the mouse to die. 1/20th. So if it's in solitude, it takes a lot for that mouse to die. But if it's in a group of other mice that are all stimulated and running around and hurrying around, then it doesn't take that much to kill it. Now here's the kicker. If you take a normal, healthy mouse and put it into a cage with mice hopped up on amphetamines, the mouse, the healthy mouse, dies within 10 minutes. Because it is not wired to live in that type of environment. I think about our culture, our society today. We're stimulating ourselves mildly with caffeine. That's not like speed at all. But we're mildly stimulating and hyping ourselves up. We're rushing around, hurrying around, and we might just be killing ourselves. High blood pressure, heart disease, stress, anxiety, worry. Now, we may not be physically killing ourselves, but maybe even at some level, I believe we're spiritually killing ourselves. That's the cost. The cost is we're doing all these things and we're overscheduling and we're running around like crazy, but there is a cost to that always. Let me flesh that out a little bit more. One of the things that we make an assumption, I think, in America and in Western thinking and in Christianity. We make an assumption that our spiritual lives are just one piece of a pie of our lives. It's just one piece of who we are. And let me give you, we've got this illustration. So we tend to look at our lives as kind of limited, like a 24-hour period, and we basically look at our lives through our schedules in a certain extent, don't we? And so we have like these pies of time, 24 hours or weeks or months, wherever we want to do it, and we compartmentalize each, and we look at our physical well-being as just a piece of our lives, and we look at our spiritual lives as just a piece of our lives, and we look at our emotional lives as just a piece, and our mental just a piece. And then, for example, I feel like, I see people going to the gym, rushing to the gym, and so I feel like, what do I feel? Oh, I got to go to the gym, right? So I look at my pie, and that would help me physically, and I think that's a good thing to go to the gym and stay healthy and exercise. So I cut out of that physical, I slice a piece of that pie, don't I? And I say, okay, I'm going to go to the gym for this amount of time. And then I think, I hear the preacher stand up on Sunday morning and say, I really need to go to church or whatever. And so then I look at that, I got to go to church. So I slice off another piece of the pie. And then I think, I'm told, and I was watching Dr. Phil this week, and Dr. Phil said I really should spend more time with my family and my wife, so I slice off another piece of the pie. And then I go to work or I go to school, and that's a lot of mental, and so that gets a big chunk of my pie. So here's the point. If I put a pie before us, and everybody wants a piece of that pie, I'd have to divide it 300 ways this morning, wouldn't I? How much pie would each of us get? Not very much. And if you've noticed, that's exactly what's happened in our culture. We keep slicing our pies thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner because we look at life this way based on our schedules. We start slicing off. So much so now that we don't actually talk on our cell phones, we text in 140 characters or less, which is a very small slice of pie for that person, right? And so if you slice up that pie 20 ways, 100 ways, or whatever, you get very little attention to any slice. And you and I won't grow in any of those areas because we've sliced off so little, the slices are so little. Because we're trying to get it all in. We're trying to put it all on the plate. We're trying to do it all. Now, John Ortberg, in his book, Everybody's Normal Till You Get to Know Him, says this. Hurry is not just a disordered schedule. Hurry is a disordered heart. Because we are simply a product of the choices we make. And those choices are heart issues. So whatever choices we make, however we decide to spend our time, that's a heart issue. Where I invest my time, how I slice my pie, that's a heart issue. The ancient Hebrews who wrote this Psalm 46, and by the way, flip over your bulletins, look at that text. There is one exclamation point in that passage. Where does the exclamation point come in that passage? Be still and know that I am God, exclamation point. No other verse has the exclamation point. That's the verse that has the exclamation point, which means pay attention here. This is the important thing. This is where the emphasis goes. See, the ancient Hebrews looked at life differently than you and I do. Remember, they didn't have cell phones, PDAs. They didn't have day timers. They didn't have all that stuff. And they looked at life like this. The soul being the core of every human being. The soul, the heart, the spirit was core and central to every person. And the mind was a reflection of the soul. And the body and the actions and the behavior of the person were a reflection of the mind and the soul. So that the core of who we are is our soul and our spirit and our heart. And also notice that the lines are not solid, because what they understood was that we're integrated. It's not like our spirit is separate from our mind, is separate from our heart, is separate from our body, like we just showed in our thought. But that we're all integrated, and one thing affects the other. So what happens to our bodies affects our souls as much as what happens to our soul affects our bodies. And that's true, right? So if we're rushing around and inside we're feeling anxiety, it creates stress that then affects what? Our body, right? We get high blood pressure, we have heart attacks, that kind of thing. So what's going on with our soul, our heart, affects what goes on with us physically, and vice versa. And so it's integrated understanding. And so in the Hebrew mind, and in ancient Hebrew wisdom, the idea is if you and I don't pay attention to our soul, what happens to us? We suffer. And we die. There are consequences to not paying attention to our souls. And so that's why the psalmist is saying, be still. Be still. Because so much, even the ancient Hebrews, they were still human like you and I, and we've just found P-days and schedules to be our way of rushing around, but I imagine that the ancient Hebrews had the same problem. They were rushing around, they were worried about things, they were stressed out about things. What they were stressed out about oftentimes was, national stuff, like who's going to come in and attack us next? Who's going to be our king? Who's going to bring us peace? How are we going to get food on our tables? And what the psalmist is saying is, they were flitting around, maybe if we worship this idol, that'll give us fulfillment, or maybe if we have a new king, that'll bring us fulfillment, or maybe if we align ourselves with this powerful nation, then we'll be protected and that'll bring us fulfillment and peace. And the psalmist is saying, guess what? None of that stuff's going to bring you peace or fulfillment. There's only one person that can bring you peace and fulfillment, and that's God. So stop rushing around and flitting from here to there and trying to get all these things, and just be still. And the second part of that verse is, know God. So it's not be still and just that's it, but it's be still to know God. Not just know about God. I know lots of people who can tell me lots of things about God, or quote me verses out of the Bible about God. But that doesn't mean a person knows God. To know God is to be in relationship with God, to relate to God, to know them. Like, I could say, well, yeah, I know Barack Obama, right? I could tell you information about Barack Obama, our president. I could probably even share with you some things that he thinks. But I don't know Barack Obama. I don't know him personally. That's the knowing that the psalmist is talking about. This idea of knowing is to know this God personally. And there's a difference. It's not just about being religious, it's about being in relationship. And so this is different, what the psalmist is saying. So how many people here this morning would like to hear from God? How many people would like to, well, you're in trouble. Somebody said at the early service, I don't want to hear from God. I'm afraid of what God's going to say to me. And that's a pretty honest answer. But we'd all like to hear that. And we always say, well, God, if you would just give me a sign, just big letters. And basically what we're saying to God, God, would you just yell into my busy life? Would you just scream at me a little bit and get my attention? And yet, God is not a screamer. When our parents raised us, what did our parents do to get our attention? They yelled at us, right? They got our attention. They raised their voice. God doesn't do that often. Sometimes, but most of the time, God speaks in the whisper, in the gentle voice. God is trying to communicate with us all the time, every day. Maybe the issue is not with God speaking, it's with us and our ability to listen. Our ability to be still enough, to quiet ourselves enough to hear God's voice. Now, I'm going to suggest a few ways to help us do that. The ancient church fathers, as well as even today, people practice these spiritual practices. And one of the practices is the practice of silence. Some of you with teenagers are going, that's a really good practice. Let's bring that one in. But silence. To strip yourself of even speaking. To just be silent. To allow God to speak to you is to be sometimes just to allow yourself to be silent. To listen, right? If I'm speaking, I'm not really listening, am I? And so silence helps us to listen. And spending periods of time in silence is important. So here's the challenge for you this week. Here's what I want you to try. How many people are going to get up tomorrow morning and drive somewhere? Drive to work or school or something, right? So I'm going to give you a way to practice silence tomorrow morning. Monday morning, it's going to come early because we haven't recovered from today's extra hour or loss of an hour. And so here's what I want to challenge you to do. When you get in your car, turn off the radio, turn off your cell phone, and simply be silent from the time you leave your house to the time you get to work. For some of you, that's going to be a long period of time. Some of you, be a short period of time. Don't answer the cell phone. Don't listen to radio. Just be silent. And here's the kicker. Drive the speed limit. Just try it. Just try it. I know I'm stretching you here this morning. I know that's a stretch. But what I want you to notice is what happens to you internally as you experience that. Silence, slowing down, not being in a rush. So you're probably going to need to get up when your alarm tells you tomorrow morning. That's going to be the key. The other thing that you can practice is solitude. I prefer solitude. Solitude is getting away from everything and getting away from people and things and distractions and putting yourself in a place where you can actually spend time with God and talk to God and God can talk to you. So solitude is a way of getting away from it all. So getting out of the house, getting away from the distractions, all the things that consume us and beg for our attention, and just give God our attention in solitude, to spend an hour in solitude or a half hour in solitude. One of the things I appreciate about running. Running is a time of solitude for me, and I can talk to God while I run, and it's just time away from everything else, and it's just routine. And then the other thing that I would encourage you to think about, if you've been reading the book Life with God that we've been doing the Lenten study with, in chapter 4, the author talks about apophatic prayer. Now that is a fancy word for meaning that you basically just be still. To pray, to be contemplative in your prayer, not to go to God with a list, but to just be still and listen for God, which is different. It's a process where you eliminate thoughts and distractions, and you simply be still, be in the presence of God, and listen for God's voice in your life. And maybe spend 20 minutes doing that, just being still and letting all those distractions go away from your mind. That's apophatic or contemplative prayer. Eliminating those things from your mind. The psalmist also said in Psalm 62:5, "In God alone my soul finds its rest and peace." I want you to notice that. In God alone. We won't find peace and rest anywhere else for our souls. Because God's the one that created those souls. And God's the one that will fill them. And to be still means simply to stop looking to all those other things in our lives to bring us peace and fulfillment. I'll just wrap up by sharing this experience that I had. I went to, some of you have mentioned before, I went to Mount Sinai a few years ago and went to the Sinai Desert. I had been speaking at a conference, in a leadership conference for a few days, so I was looking forward to getting away a couple days, and we're going to spend a couple days at St. Catherine's Monastery, which is at the base of Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. And so I was looking forward to these couple days of retreat, and I thought this would be really good to get away, get some solitude, get some, some of these things that we've been talking about. It's interesting, if you read the Gospels, you'll notice that whenever Jesus has a heavy time of ministry, what does he do after that time of ministry? You'll notice he goes away to a solitary place. So he gets away. And so we were going to St. Catherine's, and I thought this would be great retreat. I'll get to unwind some, just hang out with the guys a little bit. And so we go here, and this is a picture of the Sinai desert. It's not sand. Notice it's rocks and it's mountains. And it's not a desert, but there's no life there whatsoever. And right there in the valley, you can see the monastery, the building of the monastery. And so we went there, and we get there, and they, go in, and we eat meal, and then we go sleep. And then they wake us up at 2 a.m. in the morning. And we're actually going to hike up to the top of Mount Sinai. So we get up at 2 a.m. so that we can go be there at the top of Mount Sinai to see the sunrise. It was a beautiful sunrise. So we get up at 2 a.m. in the morning after only a few hours of sleep. We meet out the trailhead, and we start to go up the trail. And the first thing I encounter was a man who wants to rent me his camel up the mountain. He said, I'll rent you my camel. You can ride it up the mountain. I'm like, I don't need a camel. I'm going to hike all the way to the top, So I go a little bit further, and there's another man with another camel. And he wants to rent me his camel. And I was like, well, do I have to sign a waiver? Does it come with GPS? Is there something I'm missing here? I go a little further. There's another man with another camel and another couple guys with their camels. And so for the whole first mile up the mountain, I'm being accosted by camel. People wanting to rent me camels. They had Alamo camel rental, and they had, I'm just kidding. And so finally I got by all the because everybody had kind of rented the camels that were, behind us or somewhere or ahead of us, and so I kept going. About the first mile in, the guide stops us because there's a place to take a refreshment break. So you can get a soda or a bottle of water or get a souvenir, and so we stop, and we wait people to get their refreshment. So then we get on our way again, and another mile later, there's another refreshment hut selling us trinkets and food and refreshment. And all the way up the mountain, everywhere we go, there's somebody trying to sell me something. Finally, I get to the top of Mount Sinai, and I'm thinking this is going to be this great spiritual experience, right? Get to the top of the mountain, there's several under 100 people there, and we're all staking out our little spots on the top of the mountain, You ever been to the fireworks on the 4th of July down on the mall? Everybody's trying to get their blankets out and sit down, and I could rent a blanket to sit on. Now, meanwhile, by the time I got there, we still had an hour before sunrise, and nature was calling, so I went to the outhouse, and just as I was making my way into the outhouse, the only outhouse on Mount Sinai, there was a man holding out his hand to me, asking for 5 basically Egyptian dollars to use the outhouse. And if I paid extra, they would give me toilet paper. So I got up there, saw the beautiful sunrise, came back down on the mountain, all by the shops again, got back to St. Catherine's. They pointed out the gift shop to us in St. Catherine's. And I thought, well, that was really not as great as I thought it was going to be. This is where Moses saw the burning bush. This is where Moses got the 10 Commandments. And God really wasn't speaking to me at that moment. So went back, took a nap, had some breakfast, took a nap. And then we're laying, we had the rest of the day. I said, I got to get out of here. So I strapped the backpack on, and I ventured out into the Sinai desert again. And actually, where I took this picture was Mount Sinai is to the left of that picture. I started going up the mountain on the right side, and that's where I took that picture as I headed out that afternoon. And I went out into the Sinai desert and experienced silence like you and I have never, ever experienced in our lives. No birds were singing, no cars, no sound of anything, nothing. The only thing I could hear was my breathing. And it was in that silence, it was in that solitude that I began to journal and God began to speak. You see, God's not going to speak to us in the rush and the hustle and the stuff of life. God speaks to us in the quiet, in the stillness, in the silence. Amen.
As we prepare to share our bountiful